Today we're going to look at the fan favorite, the Mongol Empire. Now, people tend to really like the topic of the Mongol Empire for a couple of reasons, three maybe. One, they tend to be the exception to most rules of empire. They don't do things the traditional way and they succeeded anyway. Two, it's a pretty great underdog story. The Mongols were a people with no initial advantage whatsoever, and they kind of clawed their way to success with a lot of grit and determination and some pretty spectacular violence, and won, unusual in history. So that's always pretty interesting. And three, they present a really stark contrast. They conquered territory with really incredibly creative violence, but then they ruled it with such tolerance that was unusual for the era, that it's hard to know what to really make of them. Today's lesson takes a lot of material from the book shown in the middle, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Highly recommended if you're interested in this topic, along with a Netflix series, Marco Polo, that you should probably wait till you're a little bit older to watch, but it's about a Khanate after Genghis Khan in China. And as you can see on the slide, here's a brief introduction. Genghis Khan, in 25 short years, he and his army conquered more lands and more people than the Roman Empire ever did during its 400-year rule. So we need to think about how and why it matters. First, let's situate ourselves in time. The post-classical period is kind of disjointed, right? In Europe, it has the Dark Ages towards the beginning, with Europe pulling itself out of the Dark Ages towards the end of the period through the Crusades and with the coming of the Black Death. In the Middle East and Asia, at the beginning of this period, we saw the rise and expansion of the Arab Empire and the golden age of Islamic civilization. And now in that second bit of the period, we're going to look at the rise and expansion of the Mongol Empire. This story needs to start with geography, because the Mongols come from a place that is difficult to live. If you look at the physical map of Asia on the right, the part that's circled in yellow is roughly the zone where the Mongols came out of. It's insanely cold on top, surrounded by big deserts and big mountains. It is not the easiest place in the world to make your life. And as we've seen in prior classes, specifically about the Silk Road, Central Asia generally, because of its geography, has long been home to pastoral nomads, people who move from place to place with their animals, letting their animals graze, and then they have to move along when they run out of grass. Central Asia is full of desert and steppe and mountains, so agriculture can't grow there. The great civilizations of history so far have been fueled by massive agricultural surpluses, but in Central Asia, it's just not possible. So, pastoral nomads move from place to place to feed their domesticated pack animals, a difficult life. And they've long had a love-hate relationship with the more geographically fortunate settled civilizations that feed their populations by farming instead. As we've seen in prior classes, it's complicated, right? Sometimes pastoral nomads and settled civilizations get along, and when that happens, it's usually because pastoral nomads are critical to long-distance trade, because they're good at moving around from place to place, and because they already live in those harsh areas between civilizations. They tend to be the conduits between civilizations, the carriers, the bridges that take goods, but also ideas and technologies, and also diseases from civilizations in one place and move them to the other. So because of their critical role in long-distance trade, sometimes settled civilizations and pastoral nomads get along and cooperate. Other times, though, conflict has been the name of the game, and this is an old story. When trade relations break down, or new nomadic tribes move into an area, or the climate changes, you usually have conflict between these people and the settled civilizations around them, like the Han Dynasty or the Gupta Empire, or even the Roman Empire in the classical period. Sometimes this comes into place as small raids on outlying farms to get food. Sometimes these are full-scale attacks causing entire empires to fall. This kind of conflict pits the organization and resources of settled people, a big advantage, against the mobility and courage of the nomads. Settled people often have thick walls and heavy guns and an organized army on their side. But the nomads benefit from having very little to lose, not being constrained by traditional rules of warfare, and being super fast on a horse. In some cases, both sides lose when they clash. In other cases, the nomads actually win and end up conquering a good amount of land and cities. And Genghis Khan, who founded the Mongol Empire, is a great example. He built the largest land empire in history, and some of his descendants built similarly impressive records of conquest. Despite their walls and artillery, the cities of Eurasia fell to horsemen with bows and arrows. It wasn't just him. We've seen the Huns eventually moving west and getting the Germanic tribes in Europe all scared to move further west, and that caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Nomads from Central Asia caused the fall of the Gupta Empire, helped cause the fall of the Han Dynasty. So this is a very old story. The Mongols specifically began their lives in the steppe. And it is in this kind of place and context that the people who form the Mongol Empire would rise. Steppe is grassland, flat, thin grassland, where you can herd big pack animals like yaks and horses, but you have to keep them moving so that they can keep eating. People here survive in a number of ways. Sometimes they use big birds of prey to hunt for them. Super impressive. I recommend looking this up on YouTube. It's a heck of a thing to see. It's a difficult place to live. Keys to survival here include tribal organization, so looking out for each other. To make this work, the Mongols lived in portable tents, type things called yurts. They depended on their horses for movement, and they drank horse and yak milk. They became master archers. And when push comes to shove, raids and invasions directed at the civilizations nearby became key to surviving. So, what do we know about the people who made this empire? Look at the size of that empire. It's a pretty big empire. They were nomadic. They lived on the steppe, and that made them very vulnerable to climate change. When grasslands become deserts, conquest then becomes key to survival. Raises the question, do reasons for conquering other lands affect how you judge an empire morally? Keep that in mind because it's going to come back at you. As it turns out, the Mongols were really good at conquering territory. I mean, look at the size of the red blob on the map. The other thing about the Mongols were, because they were a nomadic culture, we don't have a ton of written sources about them that come from the Mongols themselves, because nomads don't tend to write and leave a bunch of diaries. They're on the move. It's hard to do that. So lots of what we know comes from the point of view of the people they conquered. Obviously, the people they conquered don't have a lot of warm, fuzzy feelings about, the people who won and killed a bunch of people and took their stuff. So these sources have a pretty strong and pretty specific bias to them. And as a result, history has tended to remember the Mongols as barbarians for a long time. Brutal barbarians, remembered primarily for their violence of conquest. So the question becomes, is this fair? Is this a double standard? Or is there something to it? Was there something about Mongol conquest that really was beyond the pale, beyond what should be allowed even in times of war, even back then? The question for the sequence of lessons, then, is going to be, should the Mongols be remembered for their brutality and conquest as barbarians, or for their brilliant administration of their empire? The historical record has the Mongols primarily remembered for their violence. Barbarians, people who were especially violent, especially cruel, disregarding the standard or moral norms of civilization, even for the time, which was pretty brutal. Is this fair? All civilizations engage in violent warfare. All conquest is unpleasant, bloody business that boils down to killing a bunch of people and taking their stuff. So is this reputation just violence, bias against nomadic people who settled civilizations have long tended to look down on as primitive and morally inferior? Or is it just a matter of who gets to tell the story? We get the story through the eyes of people who didn't like the Mongols, so that's why it's that way. Is some degree of violence unacceptable even in times of war? Do the reasons for conquest affect your judgment of all this? Is there a moral difference between an empire that conquers in order to survive, because literally there's no other choice, and an empire that conquers for greed, gold, for example? Does post-conquest treatment of the conquered affect your judgment? A lot of empires do not treat the people they conquer with any sort of respect, and enslavement is kind of the norm. The Mongols were super tolerant once they stopped, conquering. So does that matter? Does that affect how you judge the civilization? And then the bigger, larger moral question. Generally, do the ends justify the means? If a leader commits terrible violence but ends up improving society in the long run, do we judge him by his actions or by the results? This brings us to our key points for the day. So please pause the slide and make sure this is all in your notes. The Mongols originated as a nomadic people in Central Asia, united under Genghis Khan, and expanded through conquest to form the largest contiguous land empire in history. Contiguous means like it was all connected, not separated by oceans or anything. We've got two separate issues to keep track of. And so I have them in a T-chart. You're welcome to copy that formatting. The first question is how they conquered so much land so fast. So what were their methods of conquest? Well, first, archery. They had amazing bow and arrow skills. Second, terror. And you'll get a lot more detail about this tomorrow. They had a really strong understanding of psychological warfare and used it to their advantage. Third, horsemanship. As is the case for many nomads, they're fantastically skilled on horses. So they used horses for their speed and mobility, and they were really able to leverage that in attacks. Fourth, their military strategy was innovative. It was not constrained by the rules of the time. And the Mongols were willing to adopt military tactics and technology from other people. As a result, the Mongol approach to warfare was more total and more violent than was common for the age, leaving the Mongols with a reputation as brutal conquerors and as precursors of modern total war. Once they established themselves in territory, though, the next question becomes how they administered it, how they ruled it, because that's a really, really big chunk of land to keep power over. Well, first and foremost, and unusually for the time period, tolerance. Not only did the Mongols not force their culture on the conquered, but actually the Mongols adapted to local cultures and were willing to learn from them. This made the Mongol Empire a huge zone of religious freedom, which is very rare in history. Second, also key to success in empire building, encouraging trade and cultural diffusion. The stability and security established by the Mongols made it possible for them to re-establish the Silk Road trade networks. Remember, the Silk Roads had been unprotected and largely unsafe after the fall of the classical empires like Rome and the Han Dynasty, and in the meantime, Indian Ocean trade got bigger. The Mongols made it safe to use land-based trade again, and therefore re-established the connection between Europe and the Far East along these trade networks. And that's going to have huge historical effects down the line. At the same time, they established an international postal service and resupply stations along the Silk Roads for fast communication through the empire. Important technologies like papermaking and gunpowder diffused along the Silk Roads, but then so did disease like the plague. More on that later. Trade meant that diffusion between Europe and the Far East and everything in between had been reestablished, and that's huge. Trade plus tolerance meant that technology, goods, and information was allowed to circulate more freely and more widely, which created something of a golden age, a time period in history of political stability and economic prosperity, and usually innovation. This was called the Pax Mongolica. So pause the slide here, make sure that this is all in your notes, and then press play to see how the empire ends. In the end, and we'll get to this, the Mongol Empire declined because of succession disputes. Usually the case when you have a big, strong leader and then that leader dies, who takes over next tends to cause some conflict. We saw this with the formation and the rise of the Arab Empire. It's going to happen with the Mongol Empire too. Also, slow absorption into the cultures of the areas they conquered. The Mongols adapted so well to the cultures they conquered, they kind of became like them, became different people. Following the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire was divided into 4 different regions called khanates. You can see them on the map. These are Mongolian kingdoms. And each of these was ruled by a relative or a close associate of Genghis Khan. 3 of the more important khanates, historically, were the Empire of the Great Khan, also known as Yuan Dynasty, centered in China, and that's what the Netflix show Marco Polo is all about. But you should be a little older before you watch it if you're currently in my class. Second, the Ilkhanate centered in Persia. The Mongols conquered a good chunk of what had been the Arab Empire, including Baghdad, and this would have been that Khanate. And third, the Khanate of the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe. This is one of the foundational events in the history of Russia. Effects were different in different places. For example, in China, Mongols were able to reunite the country under one dynasty for the first time in 300 years. And because nomads depended so heavily on trade, the Mongols increased the prestige and power of merchants, who before had been considered the lowest class in Chinese society, and focused on expanding trade routes. As a result, cities grew and the arts flourished. In Persia, which was already a trade-based economy, the Mongols adopted much of Persian culture and mixed themselves into the local population. Persia's economy benefited from increased trade links to China along the Silk Roads. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at a bunch of really interesting sources to help you guys make your opinions about whether we should remember the Mongols as brutal conquerors or as brilliant administrators. For now, I want to see who's